What in this world is the nature of Jesus' second coming, as expressed by the New Testament writers? In the previous lesson, we looked at various views of when Jesus was supposed to come back. What many believers probably wish I would have distinguished in that lesson was the nature or natures of Jesus' second coming. For instance, one of the ways that some modern Christians harmonize various biblical passages about Jesus' second coming is by believing that Jesus' judgment on the earthly nation of Israel, that is, the destruction of the physical temple in 70 AD, was a different event from the great white throne judgment of Revelation 20. Another similar explanation, which I've already mentioned, is the theory that Jesus was answering two questions in his Olivet Discourse, one being about the end of the age, which some call the Mosaic, and the other about the end of the entire cosmos, after the so-called Christian age. We'll look more at these ages in a following series where we'll consider what did or didn't happen to the Mosaic Law. So now I'd like to compare several passages which give us clues regarding the nature of the Parousia. Again, I will not be digging deep for theological conclusions, but mainly examining what the text says in its plainest meaning, which I figure is the best starting point before searching for mysteries. I just hope that this analysis gives especially believers a better handle on what the authors actually say on the topic. I would ask, in order for this to be effective, that the reader at least temporarily try to ignore whatever preconceived framework they've already been taught to try to explain all these passages. Most churchgoers have been fed some paradigm for how to understand the New Testament's myriad teachings on the subject, whether it leans toward premillennialism, amillennialism, realized eschatology, or some other system of doctrine, or various combinations of several such paradigms. Most of these are mutually exclusive, contradicting the others at every turn. In other words, it is almost certain, just from merely a logical standpoint, that most of them are very wrong. In the words of the late Del Martin about biblical commentaries in general in his online Yale course of the New Testament, most of what is written about the Bible is nonsense, although he used a different word. And I say that knowing full well that many would make that observation of my lessons. And if at the end of this analysis the reader can find some sort of theological framework into which all these passages fit, great. But I would like to reiterate my warning. We probably have no business trying to explain everything that the authors did not. As noted in the previous lesson, the Hebrew Bible authors only ever speak of one coming of God's anointed, even though they give us different portraits of what he would do. There is some cryptic language in Daniel of messianic events regarding certain periods, even after the restoration of temple worship, beginning especially in chapter 9 and following. I've discussed Daniel's 490-year prophecy timeline in chapter 6 of my book, but I'd like to add that many millennialists today believe that the last week of Daniel's 77s was paused, remaining unfulfilled to even today, and the main reason is that they recognize that Daniel's timeline would have otherwise ended even before Jesus came. Most scholars interpret him as expecting the prince, the angel Michael, not the Davidic Messiah this time, to come shortly after a time of tribulation around 164 BC, when the apocalyptic end will occur. He'll defeat the cosmic evil forces, and the faithful dead are raised to everlasting life. Notice also that much of Daniel's language and expectations and terminology are followed closely by many of the New Testament writers, even if their timeline is longer, and Jesus is the one who accomplishes it. Daniel does in fact speak of events occurring after the death of the Prince of the Covenant, which many scholars believe to be the killing of the high priest Onias III in 181 BC. But of course one can see how some Christians would wonder if this was about Jesus. Regardless of how one interprets Daniel implicitly, neither Daniel nor any other Hebrew writer explicitly speaks of a second coming of the Messiah. We have to go to the New Testament for that. As a brief review, a few of the things that the Hebrew Bible writers do speak of the Davidic Messiah doing are the restoration of the eternal kingdom of Israel and law and righteousness/justice, ruling from Jerusalem, building a temple, ushering an era where Israel will finally have peace, independence, and prosperity, and protecting Israel from never again being harmed by enemies. Several prophecies even go so far as to predict that the nations will pay tribute to this anointed son of David, and that he will rule the nations and deliver God's prophetic word to the people. There is even an expectation that he will bring forgiveness as priest, as it was their sin that caused them to lose all the promised blessings of Yahweh. In fact, because some of the messianic prophecies were priestly in nature, and others were monarchical, there is even a tradition found at Qumran that there would be two messiahs. And as we've noted, Daniel in Psalm 2 and 89 and Micah 5 even go so far as to predict that Israel would become the one world order under the Messiah's rule. Therefore, one would expect no one need tell the world when the Messiah comes, as it should be obvious to all the world, unless it's some sort of spiritual mystery and not fulfilled in an earthly way. And as we've seen, Jesus left the earth without having done any of these things, at least not in a full earthly fulfillment, except for his sacrifice for the people. The only other option left, apart from spiritualizing the prophecies, was for the New Testament writers to have Jesus come back again to accomplish all things written of him. As we've seen, the tendency to speak of a second coming is nearly universal in the New Testament. But what is not universal is what they say Jesus will accomplish when he comes back, as many of the writers did in fact spiritualize Christ's kingdom, sometimes even speaking of him already reigning in heavenly places, having subjected all things under his feet, while other passages speak of him subjecting all things when he comes back. Perhaps one of the most interesting and explicit explanations for why there are two messianic comings and the purpose of the delay is in Hebrews 9:28 and 10:13. The purpose of the first was to take away sins, the second to save those who eagerly await for him. Why the delay? It's, quote, until his enemies would be made a footstool for his feet, end quote. This, of course, raises even more questions, as the prophets seem to enjoy doing. One of the most prevalent indicators of what is to happen at the Parousia, Jesus' second coming, apart from Jesus coming back, is judgment. The element of judgment is especially prevalent in all of the different accounts of the Olivet Discourse, covered in the previous lesson. As we've seen, some of those predictions of judgment appear to have already happened, such as the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. On the other hand, some do not appear to have happened, such as the earth being consumed with fire, and the cosmos being rolled up like a scroll to be replaced with a new heaven and a new earth. Another very common theme to be realized in the future for the biblical authors is a final redemption, along with the judgment that occurs at Jesus' coming. Like the parable of the wheat and the tares, both the judgment of the evil and the gathering of God's elect appear to be a future event that happens at the same time. For Paul especially, this coming was not just about merely salvation, the resurrection of the dead, and living with Jesus forever, but also a redemption of all creation, where the glory that was coming was not even to be compared with the current creation, where the children of God would be revealed and they would be freed from decay and corruption, and their bodies would be transformed into something much more glorious. We've seen several examples of how the messianic promises were pushed out into the future, where their fulfillment was believed to be quite literal and even sometimes earthly. But another tendency we've already noted is for the authors to spiritualize the arrival of the kingdom. And perhaps one of the most common ways the New Testament authors do this is in wording that seems to suggest that the judgment and redemption of Jesus coming is closely tied to our physical death. This, of course, would align perfectly with the view of some modern apologists that there is no time or even an after death. While some of the passages about the future hope of Jesus' followers point to a period where the meek inherit the earth, many others suggest not only a new earth, but also one which is after death, before which there can be no rest. Parables of the laborers in the vineyard would only receive their reward at the last day. The quote-unquote coming age was after resurrection according to Luke and John. Paul also says that when our earthly tent, that is our body, is destroyed, then we have a building from God, a permanent structure versus a temporary tent, eternal in the heavens, when what is mortal will be swallowed up by life. God's Spirit was given as a guarantee in the meantime of that future hope. Hebrews chapters 10 and 11, referencing Habakkuk 2:3, has some of the most poetic language about that hope in Christ that is to be had after death. Of course, Paul quite explicitly speaks of Jesus' second coming as an earthly event, happening during the lives of some still living, and only the resurrection of those then dead, and arriving with judgment. But perhaps some of the most interesting spiritualizations of the kingdom are the way it is portrayed as coming unobservably. One could imagine such passages used to harmonize the various teachings of the coming of Christ, despite those that explicitly say that all the nations will witness it, looking up into the clouds where it will manifest. The nature of the spiritual kingdom was not one in which the king bestowed power to those closest to him, but one in which he allowed them to die just like him, where rule was not by lording their powers over others, but by serving others, even to the point of giving one's own life. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem was not an earthly military conquest, but a heavenly one, a sacrifice by which he defeated Satan's unseen powers. Luke gets more explicit, saying that the kingdom was not observable at all. It was already among them. For John, one was born into the kingdom by water and spirit. Only the Spirit gives life, but the flesh is useless. By chapter 18, Jesus explicitly denies that his kingdom is of this world. In Acts 14:22, it's through persecution that entry into the kingdom is gained. Paul calls followers of Jesus living stones, which now comprise the true, heavenly, spiritual temple. It has been observed that such statements are radically non-apocalyptic and even a denial of eschatology itself, that there will even be an eschaton at the end of the age. Now let's consider how the New Testament writers use the Hebrew Bible and whether some of their most foundational teachings are actually taken from innovations in the Greek translation of it. In the next lesson, When God Spoke Greek.